Welcome back to another episode of Deep Quotes. This is D.
And this is Pod.
We have an interesting quote from Sonalee Rashatwar, and it is, "The desire to eradicate the existence of fat bodies can also be called eugenics." So, where do you want to start with this one?
Well, we could start at the beginning of the sentence like most people, or probably the easiest is to start at the end of that sentence with the big $50,000 word.
Eugenics.
Eugenics.
That's a pretty aggressive word to be using when you're talking about fat acceptance movement. So, what is the definition of eugenics?
So according to Oxford, eugenics is the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable heritable characteristics.
Okay, so basically controlled breeding and trying to control what genes are in the human population.
Yes.
Saying that trying to reduce the number of people that are fat or reduce the number of fat bodies, as the quote goes, that has nothing to do with breeding. That has nothing to do with genetics. Now, being overweight does have some relation to genetics. There are genetic predispositions to behaving in certain ways towards food. So genetics relates to it. But most of the people that are advocating for losing weight aren't advocating it from the perspective of genes or controlled breeding.
So Sonalee is kind of an interesting person, and understanding her perspective is a little weirder here.
What do you mean?
So when she's talking about eugenics, like she's literally talking about people not having access to certain types of fertility treatments because of their weight. It's one of her huge causes that she is...
Okay, saying that fat people can't reproduce because they don't have access to reproductive care in the same way that skinnier people do.
Yeah, that if you wanted to get IVF treatments as an example, there's often a weight limit associated with it, which from a medical perspective is pretty self-explanatory.
There's a bunch of fat in the way, so it's harder to do the procedures.
Or, it is more likely that you're going to have birth defects or problems with your pregnancy if you already have a weight problem.
Especially because part of the problem with being severely overweight to the point where you would get denied those services is that the weight is going to be pushing down on your organs as well as the baby inside of your organs. So you could damage the baby in the process, which is maybe one of the reasons that it would be refused.
Or you can have, if you already have high blood pressure, being pregnant can raise your blood pressure. If you already have diabetes, being pregnant can cause diabetes to become worse. It's really not a good idea for you to be necessarily seeking out to become pregnant if you have serious medical issues that could arise from your weight.
So, and then that's, I think, a hole in the argument is that there are very few people that are actively saying fat people should not reproduce. I'm saying few as in I don't know of any. I haven't really heard of it at all. There is limitation in what sort of care you can get because of medical complications that come up with being overweight. But I will at least grant that there is some truth that there is different medical care given to people who are fat versus people who are thin or a more average weight.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, they are treated differently, and connecting that with reproductive rights, if you receive different types of reproductive care, it's possible to attribute that to wanting to eliminate a certain type of people, but there's a big jump in logic there, but there's at least a seed to get you towards that area of logic that, yeah, technically you're being denied certain reproductive care, but it's not, it doesn't logically follow that, oh, you aren't going to actively for instance, you aren't actively going to give me food. That must mean you think I'm fat. It's a similar logical statement that you won't give me this particular type of medical treatment that happens to be related to reproduction. Therefore, you don't want me to ever have children.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, part of it also is that insurance companies and just the medical fields in general don't want to do anything that's risky that is also not inherently required. Fertility treatments as much as they are required for you to have a child, you as the mother never actually need to have one.
You can live your life without reproducing, without health ramifications.
Yeah. And like ultimately it would probably be better for your health if you don't reproduce. And that goes for pretty much anyone.
Sure. And now, not giving certain types of care does remove the choice. However, the choice can still be made by you. You can still be free to have sex and reproduce naturally. Getting assistance when you otherwise can't get pregnant is, I think, what she's talking about here, that at least what you mentioned of refusing to give certain medical treatments. She's saying that other people need to assist me as they would assist anyone else, and they need to do that uniformly, and they can't treat me differently just because I'm fat. But along the same lines, you don't have control over another person's decision. They can choose how they want to interact with you. So I do understand, though, that where she's coming from with that she wants other people to have to give care to fat people the same way that they would care for a thin person. The problem with that being that thin people and fat people are different. There are different risks associated with them. And she's basically saying that if the insurance companies won't pay for it and doctors won't do it or claim that they can't do it, that's equivalent to eugenics. And while they may be related in terms of who can reproduce, they're not actively trying to prevent you from reproducing. You have done that yourself, either by being unable to find a partner that's willing to have sex with you, or just you are not naturally able to reproduce. And that's not people enforcing eugenics on you. That is your own genes saying, hey, I can't reproduce.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's, I think part of her argument here is definitely this reproductive side. I think there is another half to this. Like, this is a very loaded quote of it not just being with regards to children, but also with, like, pre-existing fat people. And that she holds this idea that if you're trying to get rid of fat people, it's because you want to, like, recreate society in a particular way.
That the first portion of this, the desire to eradicate the existence of fat people. So there are a couple of ways that you can interpret that. I think she's not going with the route of you're trying to kill all fat people. So she's not talking about fat murderers. She's saying people who are advocating for thin culture or healthism, as I've heard people call it from the fat acceptance movement.
Or white supremacist viewpoints, which is basically what she refers to.
Spoilers, we'll do the white supremacy versus fat supremacy quotes later on, also from her. But eradicating the existence of fat people, or fat bodies. She doesn't say people, but fat bodies, because the people remain. The people will still be there, but the fat in the body no longer exists. If a version of you ceases to exist, is that the same as eradication? Because that's a claim she's making, that if I'm advocating for people to lose weight, that means that I want to reduce the number of fat bodies that are in the world. Is that the same as eradication?
I don't think so, because there's an inherent difference between being obese and being of like a particular race, which is usually what you're talking about with eugenics.
Because you can't control your race, you can control your weight.
You can't control your race, you can't control any kind of predisposition to something. Like, if
I'm predisposed to Alzheimer's because of my genes, I can't really change that. And while genes, like I mentioned earlier, do play a part in your weight, it's not in the same way, because you can take steps that are very well known. It's like, hey, you're predisposed to putting on weight really quickly. You can counter that by eating less.
And like there are very few medical conditions that are actually going to cause you to significantly put on weight without it being very obvious to you that you need to do something about it. The first one that comes to mind is Prader-Willi syndrome, which, for listeners, go look up Prader-Willi syndrome. It's terrible. You basically have no concept of being full and low muscle tone, so you simultaneously only need like 800 calories a day, and you never feel like you've eaten enough.
So you're always hungry.
You are 100% always hungry. People with that condition often die from basically just exploding their stomach.
Because they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the type of problem that it's genetic,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't really do much about that. And so you can become overweight. But that's not the type of person that most people are talking about when they're
Yeah.
trying to sell diets or
Mm-hmm.
encourage people to eat healthily, is saying, look, there are problems, medical problems that are associated with being overweight. You should try to not be overweight to a degree where you're harming yourself or you're putting yourself at great medical risk.
Mm-hmm.
Which does mean if I'm advocating for people should be thinner, that means that I'm advocating for fewer people being overweight. So it is technically trying to decrease the number of fat bodies, but you're not trying to decrease the number of people. I think that this would be similar to saying trying to convince someone to convert to Christianity is the same as trying to remove them from existence.
Yeah, well, she's looking at it from the lens of basically treating obesity as just that intrinsic characteristic of a person. That if a person is obese, then they must be obese for a reason, and that reason must be intrinsic to them as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, changing that is inherently bad.
And I can see her argument from even if you're not inherently obese and you can become thin, let's say that you can become thin, which you can by eating less, it will change you as a person. The person you existed when you were overweight no longer technically exists when you're thin.
Mm-hmm.
Your body characteristic is different. The mental change that you need to go through to go from being overweight to being thin or of a reasonable weight, that has a mental change to it, which means you are no longer the same person. The person that you were no longer exists. So to an extent, that person has been eradicated and removed from existence. But to no more extent than every single day when you wake up, you have different memories and you behave slightly differently than your yesterday self. Every single day, the person that you used to be is eradicated from existence. And it's no different between that type of eradication and the person that you were no longer existing from day to day versus losing weight. I think the only potential difference, again, defending her, is that another person is advocating for that change. So I'm saying, hey, it is a good idea to lose weight. You are advocating for that person to change and pushing your ideology on them. So what she's saying here of the desire to eradicate the existence of fat bodies, translated to normal person speak, a person wanting other individuals to be thinner and lose weight when they're obese can be called eugenics in the sense that they're trying to remove overweight bodies from existence. They're trying to affect other people into changing themselves. And if she's of the perspective that only I can make any decision about my body, then another person wanting something that is related to her body. So if I personally say thin bodies are good, to her that's implying that fat bodies are bad and that I believe she shouldn't exist. I think that's the claim that she's making.
And, like, that's a fair claim with the caveats of, one, again, fatness is something that you can change, and that it is objectively good for most people to maintain a relatively healthy weight. Like, I'm not going to sit here and try to defend the BMI scale and say that you must exactly follow what a BMI tells you is healthy, but, like, that's a good starting point for most people to aim for.
Sure. And I think the bigger thing that she's missing, that is the crux of her argument, that assuming I've interpreted her attempt at logic correctly, her problem is with other people desiring something about an aspect of her body. That the desire to eradicate the existence of fat people is saying the desire for people to be thin. If I want more people to be thin in what I would consider to be a healthy weight, that goes against what she believes is acceptable. And so that means that to her, I don't want her to exist. Because I am desiring something that involves her, and she doesn't want me to have that desire. That's what she's saying right here. She doesn't want me to have that desire, which is antithetical to her own point. She wants to be able to control my desires and my thoughts, and she doesn't want me to be able to have thoughts that are about her state of being. Me having the desire to have more thin people in the world means having fewer fat people, and that is a desire related to her existence, and she desires to not have me desire that. So it's a self-defeating argument, because she is making a statement that other people shouldn't have control over other people, but in order to do that, she has to have control over those other people.
Well, I mean, she's also looking at it from the perspective of, like, since I'm always going to be fat, therefore anyone who wants people to be skinny wants me to clearly just go away.
Or that they won't accept me for who I am, and I want to be accepted for who I am. The problem with that is that means that she basically has an external sense of self-worth, that she requires validation, assuming that that's true, that she doesn't want other people to dislike fat people means that she needs to get validation from other people that she's okay, because she doesn't seem to be okay with herself. She needs to get that from other people.
Like, I don't think what she realizes, though, is that people that want people to lose weight, as from just a societal standard, is that ultimately people with that belief want what's best for everybody.
Including the person involved.
Including that person, including their children, including just the societal costs of the medications involved, including, making sure that everyone can fit in one airplane seat.
Sure. Saying, I want to eradicate you is very different than saying, I want to help you become a better person by suggesting ways that you can improve yourself. There's a big difference between saying, I suggest you do this and I think that that will improve your life, versus you must do this to improve your life. That's the same thing, to bring in the religion example again, of the difference between saying, hey, I think you would be happy converting over to my religion, compared to convert to my religion or die. And I think that she's mixing that up, that saying that the desire, comparing losing weight to eugenics and removing people from existence, is equivalent to misunderstanding that. Telling someone, here's a good idea, you should convert to this religion, versus you must convert to this religion. No one is forcing fat people to lose weight, at least not in the United States. It's not enforced on you with the long arm of the law. It's a suggestion by other citizens that, generally speaking, want the best for you. And if someone is trying to convince you of something and they will gain no monetary benefit for it, there's a pretty good chance that they're doing it because they actually feel benevolent towards you. So I think those are the points that I wanted to cover. I think we pretty well broke down all the words in the sentence.
Yeah. We're probably going to bring back some more of this lovely...
Definitely.
Lovely specimen of a person.
Look up, again, the name is Sonalee Rashatwar.
On Instagram, she is known as the Fat Sex Therapist, which should give you a lot of information about the type of content that she is.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I think that we'll very likely be pulling in more quotes and discussing those as well. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Everyone, thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.